The call came on a Thursday evening at 6:43 p.m. My father-in-law, Gerald, was on the line. He did not say hello. He said, "We have decided to move forward without you." I did not ask what that meant. I already knew. I had known for about 3 weeks. The way you know a storm is coming, not because you checked the forecast, but because the air has changed and the birds have gone quiet. I said, "Okay." One word. He waited, probably expecting more. I did not give him more. He said, "This is a family business decision, nothing personal." I said, "I understand." Then I hung up, sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and started drafting the first of 7 formal withdrawal letters. By the next morning, everything they had been hiding behind was visible. My name is Nadia Osei. I am 35 years old. I have worked in commercial property compliance for 11 years. I review lease agreements, flag regulatory issues, manage licensing documentation, and make sure that the paperwork holding a building's operation together is airtight. It is not glamorous work. Nobody makes movies about compliance officers. But when something goes wrong, and in property management something always eventually goes wrong, I am the person everyone calls first. If you are watching this and you have ever been the person everyone calls first, tell me where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments right now. I read every single one. I married into the Mensa family 6 years ago. My husband, Kofi, is the second of 3 sons. His father, Gerald, built a mid-size property management company over 30 years in the greater Atlanta area. 12 residential buildings, 2 small commercial strips, and a reputation that Gerald polished the way some men polish shoes, constantly, publicly, and with a great deal of ceremony. His oldest son, Bernard, worked in the business full-time. Kofi managed one of the residential buildings on the side while keeping his day job in logistics. The youngest, Darius, was in and out depending on the season and what Gerald needed him to front. I started helping informally about 8 months into the marriage. Kofi mentioned that one of their lease renewal templates had a clause that would not hold up under the updated Georgia Landlord-Tenant Code. I looked at it one evening, rewrote the clause in about 20 minutes, and sent it back. Gerald called Kofi the next day and said it was the best version of that document the company had ever had. He did not call me. That detail is worth noting. That was October 2019. By March 2020, I was reviewing every lease the company issued. By the end of that year, I had rewritten their entire tenant onboarding package, restructured their vendor contract language to close 3 liability gaps, and flagged a licensing lapse on one of their commercial properties that, had it gone unnoticed, would have cost them somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 in penalties. I documented all of it. Dates, versions, correspondence, professional habit. I document everything. Gerald never acknowledged any of it directly to me. What he said at family dinners, to Kofi, to Bernard, was things like, "Kofi's wife has a sharp eye," or "She caught something the lawyers missed." Always third person, always possessive. Kofi's wife, not Nadia, not our compliance person, not someone who has been carrying this quietly for 2 years. Kofi's wife. Bernard was worse in a different way. He was the one who sent me the documents. Long email chains, always forwarded, never addressed directly, just his initials at the top, BM, as if I should already know what he needed and be grateful for the opportunity to provide it. When I asked clarifying questions, his replies were short. "You will figure it out." When I resolved something, I heard nothing. When I missed something or asked for more lead time, the response was always the same. "This is how we have always done it." That sentence, I heard it at least 40 times over 4 years. Kofi tried. I want to be honest about that. He was not blind to what was happening, but he had grown up in a house where Gerald's system was the only system, and 35 years of that shapes how a person moves through the world. He would say, "I appreciate everything you do for us, the family, the business, one combined unit." He rarely said, "I appreciate what you do for me." There is a difference. I understood that difference before I could explain it. By the time 2022 arrived, I was doing work that a dedicated compliance contractor would have billed at approximately $3,800 a month. I know that because I looked it up. I had a contact at a firm downtown, a woman named Priya who had been in the industry as long as I had. I called her one afternoon and described the scope of work without naming names. She listened carefully and said, "That is a part-time retainer minimum. Nobody should be getting that for free." I thanked her and filed the number in the back of my mind. I was not looking for payment. I want to be clear about that. What I wanted was simpler and harder to give. I wanted to be spoken to directly. I wanted Gerald to call me instead of calling Kofi about something I did. I wanted Bernard to address a single email to my name. I wanted one family dinner where someone asked about my work the way they asked about Bernard's new truck or Darius's weekend plans. That is all. It was not a large request. It was never fulfilled. The Hargrove gilding deal was where everything changed. Gerald had been negotiating to acquire a 6-unit commercial property on the east side of the city for nearly a year. It was the biggest deal the company had attempted since 2015. He was planning to close in early spring of 2023, and he had been using my compliance analysis, my risk assessment, and my regulatory research as the backbone of his due diligence for 4 months without telling the seller's team, his own attorney, or anyone outside the family that I existed. I found that out on a Tuesday in February. And that was when I understood what Thursday's phone call would eventually sound like. Let me explain what commercial property due diligence actually involves, because what I did for the Hargrove deal was not simple background research. It was the kind of work that determines whether a transaction closes cleanly or collapses 6 months after signing. When a company acquires a commercial property, someone has to go through every document attached to that building. Existing tenant leases, vendor service agreements, utility contracts, municipal licensing, zoning compliance records, certificate of occupancy history, outstanding code violations, and any pending litigation connected to the address. Most buyers hire a compliance firm or a real estate attorney with a dedicated review team to handle this. Gerald hired nobody. He had me. I started the Hargrove review in October 2022. Gerald sent the initial document package through Kofi. No cover note, no scope of work, no timeline discussed. Just a shared folder link and a message from Kofi that said, "Dad wants your eyes on this one." I opened the folder. There were 214 files. I documented the time, 9:22 p.m. on a Wednesday. Over the next 11 weeks, I worked through every document in that folder. I found 4 active tenant leases with automatic renewal clauses that had not been properly noticed, meaning the seller was already locked into 2 additional years with 2 commercial tenants at below market rates. I found a vendor agreement with a pest control company that included an exclusivity clause. Whoever acquired the building would be contractually obligated to that vendor for 3 more years at a fixed rate that was 30% above current market pricing. I found a lapsed health and safety inspection certification on the building's shared ventilation system, and I found a noise ordinance complaint filed by an adjacent property owner that had never been formally resolved. None of these issues were deal breakers on their own, but together they represented negotiating leverage worth approximately $90,000 in price reduction or concession. I wrote a 14-page review document, clear headings, plain language, specific clause references, recommended actions for each item. I sent it to Kofi on January 9th, 2023. He forwarded it to Gerald and Bernard that same evening. Gerald used my review document in his renegotiation meeting with the seller on January 19th. I know the date because Kofi mentioned it at dinner. Gerald walked in with printed copies of my findings and used them point by point. He secured a $74,000 price reduction and a vendor contract buyout commitment from the seller. It was, by any measure, a successful negotiation. Gerald called Kofi afterward. Kofi put the phone on speaker while he was cooking. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop. Gerald said, "Tell Bernard the due diligence held up. The seller's team was not prepared for how detailed it was." Kofi said, "Nadia put that together." There was a pause. Gerald said, "Good, we close in March. I need the licensing paperwork reviewed before then." Then he hung up. That was it. No name, no acknowledgement. The document that saved him $74,000 disappeared into the transaction, and I became invisible again. I sat with that for a few days. I did not raise it with Kofi. He would have said something like, "You know how he is," which was true and also not the point. Instead, I called Priya. We had lunch on a Friday. I told her the full picture this time, names included. She set her fork down. "Nadia, does the seller's team know you exist?" I told her I did not think so. "Does Gerald's attorney know who prepared that review?" I said I had never been introduced to Gerald's attorney. She looked at me steadily. "So there is a 14-page compliance document that likely influenced a 6-figure negotiation, and your name is nowhere in the official record?" "Correct. And you are doing this as a family favor?" "Also correct." She picked her fork back up. "That is not a favor. That is labor. And the fact that your name is not attached protects him, not you." I drove home thinking about that. Protects him, not you. I had never framed it that way before. I had been thinking about the situation as a respect problem. Priya had just shown me it was also a liability problem. If anything in that review turned out to be incorrect or incomplete, there was no paper trail connecting me to the work. But there was also no paper trail protecting me from being quietly blamed if something went wrong. I was useful and invisible at the same time. That combination works perfectly for the person being served and very poorly for the person doing the serving. The family dinner in February was the one that settled it for me. Gerald hosted on a Sunday, the usual gathering. Kofi's mother, Celestine, Bernard and his wife Trisha, Darius and his girlfriend. I brought a sweet potato dish I had been making for 6 years at these dinners. Nobody had ever asked for the recipe. I mention that only because it is the kind of detail that accumulates. Gerald spent most of dinner talking about the Hargrove closing. He was proud of the deal. He should have been. It was good work. He talked about the price reduction, the vendor concession, the strength of the negotiation. Bernard nodded along, adding details where he had been present. Darius asked questions. Celestine refilled everyone's water. At one point, Trisha said, "How did you know about all those lease issues?" Gerald smiled. "You have to do your homework." Bernard said, "We went through everything carefully." I was sitting 4 seats away. I watched Kofi look at his plate. He knew. He chose quiet. I had seen him make that choice before. After dinner, Darius pulled me aside in the kitchen while I was wrapping the leftover dish. "Hey, Nadia, Dad said the paperwork on this deal was really solid. I know that was probably you." He said it low, almost like a confession. I looked at him. "Gerald said that?" Darius shook his head. "No, I just know how things work around here." He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and went back to the living room. That was the closest thing to acknowledgement I received in 4 years of work. I went home that night and opened my documentation folder. I had been keeping it since 2019. Every document I had reviewed or drafted, every email chain, every date and version. 47 separate files. I read through them slowly, not emotionally, just clearly the way I read a lease, looking for what was actually there versus what I had been telling myself was there. What was there was 4 years of professional work treated as a household contribution, the kind of thing you do because you are part of the family, like bringing the sweet potato dish. I opened a new document. I titled it Withdrawal Timeline. I did not write anything in it that night. I just saved it, closed the laptop, and went to bed. 3 weeks later, Gerald made his call. I want to be precise about what happened the morning after Gerald's call, because people assume that when someone finally decides to stop, there is a dramatic moment, a breaking point, some loud internal shift. That is not how it worked for me. I woke up at 6:11 a.m., made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the withdrawal timeline document I had created 3 weeks earlier. The decision had already been made. I was just executing it. The first letter took me 40 minutes to write. I addressed it to Gerald Mensa, copied Bernard Mensa, and blind copied my personal attorney, a woman named Sandra Achebe, who practiced contract and property law out of a small office in Decatur. I had called Sandra 2 weeks before Gerald's phone call, not because I was planning anything specific, because Priya's words had stayed with me. Protects him, not you. I wanted to understand exactly what my exposure looked like before I made any moves. Sandra had been direct. You have no formal agreement, which means you have no formal liability, but you also have no formal credit. If this deal closes and something surfaces later, your involvement could be reconstructed from the email chains alone. My advice is to get out of the pipeline cleanly and document that you did. So that is what the first letter was, a clean exit, documented. I wrote that I was formally withdrawing from any advisory, review, or compliance support role related to Mensa Property Group and its associated transactions, effective immediately. I noted that my withdrawal applied to all current and pending matters, including but not limited to the Hargrove Street acquisition scheduled to close in March 2023. I stated that no work product produced after the date of this letter should be attributed to me in any filing, negotiation, or legal proceeding. I kept the language neutral. No accusations, no grievances, just a clear line drawn in plain language. I read it once, then again. I sent it at 7:04 a.m. The second letter went to the Hargrove deal's closing attorney, a man named Raymond Polk, whose firm handled Gerald's transactions. I had never spoken to Raymond directly. He did not know I existed. My letter introduced myself, explained that I had prepared the due diligence review document dated January 9th, 2023, and stated that I was no longer involved in any advisory capacity related to this transaction going forward. I attached a copy of my review document with my name and credentials on the cover page, which I had quietly added the night before. I wanted a record that the work existed and that I had produced it. Sandra had suggested this step. If that document ever becomes relevant in a dispute, you want your authorship on record somewhere outside Gerald's filing system. Raymond Polk's assistant called me at 9:30 a.m. She said Mr. Polk would like to schedule a brief call. I replied by email only. I said I was available for a short call Thursday afternoon and that all communication regarding this matter should be in writing going forward. She confirmed Thursday at 2 p.m. The third letter was the hardest to write, not emotionally, structurally. It went to Kofi. I did not send it by email. I printed it, set it on the kitchen table, and called him at his office. I told him there was something at home he needed to read before he spoke to his father. He asked me if everything was okay. I said yes, everything is fine. Come home when you can. He came home at 12:40 p.m. I was in the kitchen. He picked up the letter, read it standing at the table. It took him about 4 minutes. When he finished, he set it down, pulled out a chair, and sat. You already sent the others. It was not a question. This morning. He was quiet for a moment. Dad called me at 8:15. He said your email was out of line. I had expected that. What did you tell him? I said I would talk to you. He looked at the letter again. Nadia, the closing is in 6 weeks. I know. There is no one else who knows that file the way you do. I know that too. He leaned back. He was not angry. Kofi processed things slowly and honestly, which was one of the reasons I had married him. He said, "Is this about Sunday dinner?" I looked at him. It is about 4 years of Sunday dinners. He did not argue that. He sat with it for a while. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" That question, 4 years in the making. I told him what I needed. I needed him to stop forwarding me his father's document requests. I needed him to stop describing my work as something the family had handled. And I needed him to understand that I was not doing this to damage Gerald's deal. I was doing it because I was done being a resource that nobody acknowledged existed. He nodded slowly. Okay. Okay meaning you agree, or okay meaning you need more time? Okay meaning I should have said this a long time ago. He folded the letter carefully, the way he handled anything he intended to keep. I am sorry I did not. I had not expected that either. I had prepared for resistance. His honesty caught me off guard in the best possible way. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. We sat like that for a few minutes without talking. Then my phone lit up on the counter. Gerald. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Bernard. I let that go too. I documented both calls. 12:58 p.m. and 1:02 p.m. Thursday, February 16th, 2023. That afternoon, I sent 2 more letters. One to a vendor whose service contract I had been quietly managing as an extension of the Mensa portfolio work. I informed them that I was no longer the point of contact for that account and that all future communication should be directed to Gerald Mensa directly. The second letter went to a city licensing office where I had been tracking a renewal deadline on one of the company's residential properties. I withdrew my name from the correspondence record and provided Gerald's business address as the new primary contact. Each step was clean. No commentary, no grievances attached. I was simply removing myself from every channel I had been occupying quietly for 4 years. By 4 p.m. that Thursday, I had sent 7 formal communications. I saved copies of all of them to my documentation folder, backed everything up to my cloud drive, and emailed the full package to Sandra. Gerald called 4 more times between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. He did not leave a voicemail until the 4th call. His message was 43 seconds long. His voice was controlled, but tight. He said my withdrawal letter was inappropriate, that the timing was damaging to the family business, and that we should discuss this in person before I took any further steps. He said, "This is not how family handles things." I listened to the message once. I did not call back. I replied by email at 6:22 p.m. I wrote that I appreciated him reaching out, and that any concerns about the withdrawal could be directed to my attorney, whose contact information I included. I wished the Hargrove closing well. Bernard sent a text at 7:48 p.m. It said, "You are creating a serious problem." I read it, saved a screenshot, and did not reply. Kofi made dinner that night. He did not talk about his father or the closing. He talked about a logistics problem he had been managing at work, a container shipment that had been misrouted twice in the same week. I listened and asked questions, and we ate at the table like a normal evening. After dinner, he washed the dishes and I dried them, and somewhere in the middle of that ordinary task, I realized I felt lighter than I had in about 2 years. Not happy exactly, not relieved yet, just lighter. The specific weight of being needed without being seen had been on me so long, I had stopped feeling it as a separate thing. Now that it was gone, I could feel the outline of where it had been. At 9:15 p.m., I opened my laptop, updated my documentation folder with the day's activity log, and closed it. Gerald's closing was scheduled for March 14th. It was now February 16th. They had 26 days to find someone who understood that file well enough to get them to the table cleanly. I gave them nothing further to work with and wished them exactly what I said I wished them. Good luck. The first call from Raymond Polk's office came on Thursday at 2 p.m., exactly as scheduled. Raymond himself was on the line, not his assistant. That told me something. Attorneys do not personally take calls they consider routine. He introduced himself, confirmed he had received my letter and the attached review document, and then said something I had not anticipated. He said, "Miss Osei, I want to be direct with you. The document you attached is the primary due diligence record for this transaction. I was under the impression it had been prepared by an outside compliance firm." He paused. "It was not submitted to me with any authorship identified." I let him finish before answering. "That is correct." It was not. Were you engaged formally for this work? I was not. Another pause, longer this time. Ms. Osei, I am going to need to ask you some questions about the scope of your involvement, because what you are describing has implications for how this transaction is documented going forward. I told him I was happy to answer questions in writing. He agreed. I documented the call, 2 p.m. to 2:14 p.m., February 16, 2023. His written questions arrived by email at 4:30 p.m. the following day, 7 questions total. Clear, professional, specific. When did I begin the review? What documents did I have access to? Whether I had identified myself to any third party during the process. Whether I had been compensated. Whether I was aware of any material issues in the file that had not been disclosed to the seller's team. That last question. I read it twice. I forwarded the email to Sandra. She called me within the hour. He is asking because if there are disclosure issues and your review identified them, the transaction could have a problem. She was calm but focused. Were there anything in your findings that Gerald did not use in the renegotiation? I opened my review document. I went through it item by item against what Kofi had told me about the January 19th meeting. Gerald had raised 4 of the 7 items I flagged: the vendor exclusivity clause, 2 of the lease renewal issues, the health and safety certification lapse. 3 items had not been raised: the unresolved noise ordinance complaint, a 3rd lease renewal issue involving a subtenant clause, and a note I had flagged in the appendix about a gap in the building's elevator maintenance records that potentially triggered a city inspection requirement. I told Sandra. She was quiet for a moment. Did Gerald know about all 7 items? He had the full document. Then he selectively disclosed. She did not say it with alarm, just clarity. That is his problem, not yours. But you need to answer Polk's questions honestly. I drafted my responses to Raymond that evening. I was accurate, complete, and neutral in tone. I confirmed the full scope of my review. I confirmed I had not been formally engaged or compensated. I confirmed I had not communicated with any third party during the process, and I answered his final question by attaching my complete original review document, all 14 pages, with all 7 items clearly listed. I sent it at 8:47 p.m. I documented the time. Gerald called at 11:06 p.m. that night. I did not answer. He called again at 11:14 p.m. Then Bernard at 11:31 p.m. Then Gerald again at 7:22 a.m. the following morning. I counted 11 missed calls over 14 hours. I replied to none of them. I forwarded each missed call log to Sandra with a note. She replied with 2 words: good documentation. The voicemail Gerald left at 7:22 a.m. was different from the first one. The control tightness was gone. His voice had the texture of someone who had not slept. He said Raymond Polk had contacted him the previous evening with concerns about the due diligence record. He said this situation was becoming complicated and that I needed to call him back immediately. He said, Nadia, I am asking you as family. I listened to it once, saved it to my documentation folder, replied by email. I wrote that I had responded to Mr. Polk's questions fully and honestly, and that any further concerns about the transaction should be addressed through legal counsel. I included Sandra's contact information again. Bernard texted at 8:03 a.m., You went to the closing attorney? Do you understand what you have done? I saved the screenshot, did not reply. Kofi read the voicemail transcript I showed him over breakfast. He set his coffee down. He did not defend his father. He said, What happens now? I told him Raymond would likely require the seller's team to be informed of the complete due diligence record, that the 3 undisclosed items would need to be addressed, that the closing timeline might shift. He nodded slowly. And Dad? I told him that was between Gerald and Raymond. Kofi looked at his coffee. He is going to say you did this on purpose. I said, I answered an attorney's questions honestly. That is all I did. Kofi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know. The closing was postponed on February 24th. Raymond's office sent a formal notice to all parties. The seller's team had requested additional time to review newly surfaced items in the due diligence record. The postponement did not specify a new date. I found out through Kofi, who found out through Bernard, who found out through a phone call that apparently lasted 22 minutes and ended with Bernard using language Kofi declined to repeat directly. Gerald requested a meeting, not through Kofi. He called Sandra's office. Sandra told me and asked how I wanted to handle it. I said I would meet him once, in a neutral location, with Sandra present if he brought his own counsel. Gerald agreed to the terms. We scheduled it for March 2nd at 11 a.m. at Sandra's office. I prepared for that meeting the way I prepare for any significant review, methodically. I printed the full documentation folder, every letter I had sent, every email exchange, every call log, every version of the review document. I organized it into a single binder, tabbed and dated, 41 pages total. I set it on my desk the night before and did not look at it again until morning. Gerald arrived with his own attorney, a man I did not recognize. Sandra and I were already seated when they came in. Gerald looked tired in a way that went past one bad week. He sat down, adjusted his jacket, and looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before. Not anger, something closer to a man recalculating a situation he thought he had controlled. His attorney opened. He said Gerald wanted to understand my intentions in contacting the closing attorney and whether there was a path to resolving this matter cooperatively before the closing timeline was further affected. I let him finish. Then I opened the binder and placed it on the table. I said, I did not contact Raymond Polk to create a problem. I contacted him to establish that I was no longer involved in this transaction and to ensure my authorship of that review document was on record. I turned to the first tab. This is every communication I sent on the day of my withdrawal. Each one is dated and timestamped. I turned to the second tab. This is the original review document I prepared in January, all 7 items. Gerald had this document for 5 weeks before the January 19th renegotiation meeting. I looked at Gerald directly. 4 items were raised, 3 were not. Gerald's attorney started to speak. Gerald put his hand up. He looked at the binder. He looked at me. He said, I did not think the other 3 were material enough to raise. His voice was even, too even. The voice of someone choosing their words carefully because they understood the room they were in. Sandra spoke for the first time. Mr. Mensah, that determination was not yours alone to make once a formal review had identified them. Silence. Gerald's attorney made a note. Gerald looked at the table. Then he looked up at me and said something I had not expected. He said, How much would it take to bring you back on for the closing? Not apologize, not acknowledge what the past 4 years had been, just a number. How much? I closed the binder. I said, I am not available for this transaction. I am not available for any Mensah Property Group matter going forward. I said it the way I would read a clause aloud, plainly, completely, without room for negotiation. I said, what I would like is for this meeting to be the last one. Gerald's attorney said they would need time to review the documentation. Sandra said that was fine and that copies would be provided. We stood. I picked up my binder. Gerald remained seated. As I reached the door, he said, Nadia. I turned. He said, I did not think it needed to be formal. You are family. I looked at him for a moment. I said, that is exactly the problem, Gerald. Then I walked out. Sandra walked me to my car. She said, that went as well as it could have. I thanked her. I drove home, made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and did not open my laptop. I just sat there for about 20 minutes. The binder was on the table in front of me, 41 pages of 4 years of work. I put it in the filing cabinet in the spare room and closed the drawer. The Hargrove closing was rescheduled 3 times. The seller's team engaged their own compliance reviewer for the 3 undisclosed items. 2 of them required price renegotiation. The elevator maintenance gap triggered a city inspection that delayed occupancy certification by 6 weeks. The final closing happened on April 29th, 7 weeks late, at a final price $38,000 lower than Gerald's February agreement. I know these details because Raymond Polk's office sent me a courtesy notification confirming my name had been properly credited in the transaction record as the original due diligence preparer. It was a single paragraph, professional, clean, final. I read it once, saved it to my documentation folder, and made coffee. By then, I had already moved on. The weeks after the March 2nd meeting were quieter than I expected. Gerald did not call again. Bernard sent one final text on March 8th. It said, "The deal is a mess. I hope you are satisfied." I saved the screenshot, added it to the documentation folder, and did not reply. That was the last direct communication I received from anyone in the Mensa family business for a long time. Kofi was navigating his own version of the fallout. Gerald had called him multiple times in the days following the meeting. Kofi told me about each call without prompting, which I appreciated. He said his father alternated between frustration and something that sounded like genuine bewilderment. Gerald kept returning to the same question. Why did she not just talk to me first? Kofi said he had answered that question the same way each time. She tried, Dad, for 4 years. Gerald did not have a response to that. The calls became shorter and less frequent through March. Darius reached out once, a text, not a call. He said, "I heard what happened. For what it is worth, I always thought you were getting a raw deal." I replied, "Thank you, Darius." That was all. It was enough. Celestine, Kofi's mother, called me on a Saturday morning in late March, not about the business. She called to ask how I was doing. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing significant. Her garden, a book she was reading, Kofi's childhood habit of refusing to eat anything orange. Before she hung up, she said, "Gerald is proud in ways that cost him more than he realizes." She did not elaborate. I did not ask her to. Some things are said completely in one sentence. At work, I was steadier than I had been in months. I noticed that in small ways. My documentation was sharper. My review timelines were cleaner. A colleague named Marcus, who had been in commercial compliance for 15 years, pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "Whatever you sorted out, it shows." I had not told Marcus the details. He knew enough from the shift in how I carried myself. Some people read body language the way I read lease clauses. Marcus was one of them. In April, Priya called me. She said a mid-size property group in Buckhead was looking for a senior compliance consultant on a formal retainer basis. 3 days a month, structured scope of work, written agreement, proper compensation. She had recommended me. I asked her what the rate was. She told me. It was $4,100 a month. I sat with that number for a moment. Then I said yes. I signed the retainer agreement on April 11th. My name was on the cover page. The scope of work was defined clearly. The compensation was listed in plain language. It was the first formal agreement I had signed for compliance work in 11 years of doing it. I read it twice before signing. Professional habit. I want to say something about that retainer agreement because it matters more than it might seem. For 4 years, I had provided the same category of work as an invisible contribution to a family business. The work was identical in quality. The difference was a piece of paper with my name on it and a defined exchange. That piece of paper did not make the work more valuable. It made the relationship honest. There is a significant difference between those two things, and I had spent 4 years confusing them. The Buckhead group was straightforward to work with. They sent documents with proper cover notes. They addressed emails to me by name. When I flagged an issue, the principal called me directly to discuss it. When I resolved something, there was a brief, professional acknowledgment. Nothing excessive, just the ordinary courtesy of one professional to another. I had forgotten how uncomplicated that felt. In May, Kofi and I found the house. We had been looking casually since February, not urgently, just keeping an eye on listings in a neighborhood we liked, about 20 minutes east of the city. Smaller lots, older trees, the kind of street where people walk dogs in the evening and wave at each other without stopping. We looked at 4 properties over 6 weeks. The 5th one was right. 3 bedrooms, a study, a backyard with an oak tree that had been there longer than the house. The kitchen needed updating. The floors were original hardwood, worn in the good way that means people have lived there. I walked through it once and knew. Not emotionally. Practically. The bones were sound, the location was right, the price was within what we had been saving toward for 3 years. We made an offer on May 19th. It was accepted on May 21st. I handled our side of the compliance review myself. Every document, every inspection report, every title search. I knew exactly what I was looking at. There were no surprises. The closing happened on June 30th at 10 a.m. Kofi and I sat across a table from a closing attorney neither of us had met before. She walked us through the documents efficiently and professionally. When we signed the final page, she said, "Congratulations, you are homeowners." Kofi shook her hand. I shook her hand. We walked out into the parking lot and stood in the June heat for a moment. Kofi said, "We own a house." I said, "We do." He put his arm around my shoulder. We stood there for about 30 seconds, just standing. Then we got in the car and drove to the house that was now ours. I want to tell you about Celestine because she is the part of this story I think about most. In July, I found out through Kofi that Celestine had been trying to sort out a lease dispute on a small rental property she owned separately from Gerald. A tenant had stopped paying, the notice process had been handled incorrectly, and she was facing delays in the eviction timeline because of a procedural error her property manager had made. She had not asked me for help. She would not have. Celestine was not someone who asked for things easily. I called her on a Tuesday evening. I said I had heard she was dealing with a lease issue, and that I would be happy to look at it if she wanted a second pair of eyes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I did not want to bother you." I said, "You are not bothering me." I reviewed her documents that weekend. The procedural error was fixable. I drafted a corrected notice, walked her through the proper filing sequence, and connected her with a property attorney in her area who could handle the court filing. I did not charge her. I did not tell Gerald. This was between Celestine and me. Her tenant situation resolved by August. She called me when it did. She said, "I do not know how to thank you." I said, "You do not need to." She said, "I am going to anyway." She showed up at our new house 2 weeks later with a set of ceramic bowls she had made herself. She did pottery on weekends. I did not know that about her. We sat in the kitchen for 2 hours and talked. She told me about the early years of her marriage, the years before the business grew, when Gerald was still someone who worried about things and showed it. She said, he stopped letting people see him uncertain somewhere around 1998, and he has been paying for it ever since. I made tea and listened. Celestine came back the following month, and the month after that. She and I built something separate from everything else. Clean and honest, and not tangled up in any of the history. That mattered to me more than I can explain simply. Gerald called Kofi in September. He said the Buckhead Group had contacted him about a potential joint venture on an East Side property. He said he had heard I was consulting for them now. He said, "She is good at what she does." Kofi told me this over dinner. He watched my face when he said it. I picked up my fork. "He is right," I said. "I am." Kofi smiled. We ate dinner and talked about the oak tree in the backyard and whether it needed trimming before winter. That was the last time Gerald's name came up at our table for a while. Here is what I know now that I did not have the words for 4 years ago. There is a version of being useful that looks like belonging but is not. It has the same surface texture. You are included. You are called. You are relied upon. But inclusion based entirely on what you provide is not the same thing as being wanted for who you are. The difference is not always obvious from the inside. It becomes obvious the moment you stop providing. If the warmth disappears when the usefulness stops, it was never warmth. It was transaction wearing warmth's clothing. I was not a victim in this story. I want to be clear about that. I participated in the arrangement for 4 years. I told myself it was generosity. Sometimes it was. But generosity given without limits, without acknowledgment, without any honest exchange, eventually stops being generosity and becomes a habit that the other person mistakes for obligation. When I withdrew, Gerald's genuine shock was not cruelty. It was the shock of someone who had genuinely forgotten there was a person attached to the resource. That does not make it acceptable. It just makes it human. And understanding it as human, rather than malicious, was the thing that let me leave without bitterness. The house has been ours for 8 months now. The kitchen is updated. The floors are the same. The oak tree did not need trimming. On weekend mornings, I sit in the study with coffee, and my documentation folder is not on the desk. There is nothing in that study that needs to be protected or tracked or quietly managed. It is just a room in a house that belongs to me. My retainer with the Buckhead Group renewed in October. My name is on the agreement, the scope is defined, the compensation is fair. That is what professional looks like when it is done honestly. If you have been the person in your family who holds things together quietly, who gets called first when something breaks and thanked last when something works, I want you to hear this clearly. Your expertise is not a family contribution. It is a professional skill. Those two things can exist in the same life, but they cannot occupy the same transaction without one of them getting lost. Know which one you are giving and make sure the exchange is honest. The door to that chapter is not slammed. It is simply closed, gently, clearly, and from the inside. If this story sat with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. Tell me where you are watching from and whether any part of this felt familiar. I read every single one. Subscribe if you have not already. I will see you in the next one.